It's such an honor to come after Annette, who gave such a wonderful welcome to country. And I guess I'm starting in a similar position of thinking from COVID and the legacies of COVID as they kind of refract through our society at this convergent moment. So I hope my contribution today will really speak to the kind of fulcrum that a lot of people sit in between different axes of inequality from an anthropological perspective. I'm going to read my talk as we often do in anthropology. So please relax and join me on some of the stories within some of the stories that I was privileged enough to encounter. But first, I just wanted to say a heartfelt thank you to Deakin Science and Society Network, to Professor Emma Caval, who has just, moved heaven and earth for me to be here today, which is so meaningful to me, being from Australia and to engage intellectually in Australia. A huge thank you to Professor Fiona Andrews and to the Home Strategic Research Innovation Network. This is my first keynote, so it's very exciting for me to be here, and I really, really appreciate all the work that you've done for me. If someone could just tell me when I got about 10 minutes left, I'd appreciate that. So thank you very much. So I'm going to begin with a testimony from a woman I met called Waris. I became homeless on December 29th, 2021, Waris explained. Waris became homeless following an eviction by a private landlord, after which she, along with her husband and 6 children, was placed in a hotel by the Birmingham City Council. When Waris refers to herself as a homeless, I am a homeless, she does not mean that she is rough sleeping. Rather, for Waris and many Somali women in the UK Midland city of Birmingham, homelessness is a protracted existential condition that layers successive moments of movement between hostels, hotels, and temporary houses in the British housing system, with longer histories of displacement and asylum seeking. Before Waris and her family were evicted, she thought that she had finally found a safe place to live. Although it was small, she told me, when we met at a community centre in Birmingham, it had no damp. It was a beautiful home that I fixed up for us. Yet, in December 2021, her private landlord instructed her that he needed his property back for his son was getting married. With private rents skyrocketing as the cost of living crisis deepened, Waris returned to the council housing department and was declared statutorily homeless. Her family were placed in 2 rooms in a budget hotel 6 miles away, distant from her children's schools and the support of her kin and community. The family remained there for a month. There was no internet, no laundry facilities, nowhere to cook, Waris recounted. After this, Waris was moved to a temporary council house. Waris would wake her daughter at 5 a.m. to take her to school. The long daily journey on multiple buses and successive moves worsened her daughter's learning disabilities. After teachers and doctors wrote to the council, Waris was moved again to another temporary house. She was told she could not view the property before relocation. They said, "No, you don't have a choice to take it or not," she explained. "I don't think this house was intended to be a family home. It seems like it was built to be rented per room, as offices or for single tenants." After several weeks, mold began to creep through the property. Waris began to cough, and her children developed asthma and skin rashes. She explained, "The kids are sleeping on broken beds and the mattresses are used. That's why my kid's skin is like this. My daughter layers so many blankets. If you see it, your body would reject it. It's so dirty and stained." Waris tried in vain to contact the landlord and council housing officers, but her calls were ignored. It's like the council threw us away. Like many Somali mothers, Waris sees her greatest responsibility as the provision of a safe home for her children, free of the instability and overcrowding that she remembers from her childhood as a refugee. Yet this responsibility is stymied by the persistent, precarious conditions of housing on both the private rental and social housing markets. "I feel like I am being punished," Waris told us. They brought me here like a prisoner seeking help. Waris felt that even though she had settled permanently in the UK, she was a citizen. She was still being considered a refugee. The twin crises of housing and mental ill health mark contemporary life in post and settler colonial contexts. The severity and entanglement of such crises can be traced to a fundamental contradiction that sits at the heart of asset economies, surrounding the question, what is a house? From the public health perspective, and from the perspective of many of the activist and housing justice actors who may sit in this room, a house is a dwelling space that promotes well-being, shelter, access to clean water, clean air, and psychic security. For a tenant or occupant like Waris, a house is a home that secures relational and psychic flourishing. Such definitions are fundamentally at odds with the way in which a house or housing stock is defined by policymakers within an asset economy, oriented toward productivity and growth. For a landlord, homeowner, or mortgage lender, a house is an asset owned in pursuit of financial returns or capital gains, such that they have little vested interest in the well-being of those who inhabit the house, unless it is themselves, but instead have a vested interest in extracting rent while keeping maintenance costs low. At a policy level, the contradiction between a house as a home and house as an asset is perpetuated by the delinking of housing and health as policy domains within central and local government in asset economies like the UK and Australia. A suite of housing policies reduce the rights of tenants while protecting homeowners and investors through measures such as excluding house prices from the calculation of inflation or offering tax breaks on investment properties. These fiscal policies are fundamentally at odds with health policies that aim to protect and promote the well-being of anybody who lives in a house. But such fiscal policies are not at odds with, but are indeed supported by, migration policies, like hostile environment visa checks in the UK and asset-based visa provisions in Australia, that exclude non-citizens from securing stable and secure housing, or those who come with refugee or asylum status. Indeed, the outcomes of this policy contradiction amplify intersecting racial, class, and gender inequalities of health and mental health in our economies, since Black and ethnic minority groups and single mothers are less likely to own a home and more likely to be social or private tenants. Listening to the distress caused by the challenges of housing is often difficult to capture for public health researchers, as it exceeds biomedical and psychiatric registers of affliction. Instead, housing distress appears as a subjective experience of a life. For Somali women like Waris, the term homeless was often used with the indefinite article, I am a homeless, diverging from representations of homelessness as rough sleeping or couch surfing. Emic articulations of homelessness, as we say in anthropology, expressions that are in people's own life worlds, spoke to a condition of protracted displacement that Somali diaspora have experienced beginning long before the present housing crisis that they encountered, and uncontained by legal temporality or spatiality of refugee status. More than a decade post-arrival, Somali women were cycling through different forms of temporary accommodation that were not fit for their needs. This experience of homelessness is belied by a longer history of displacement, where the UK Somali diaspora have undergone multiple transnational migrations within Africa, the Middle East, and Europe since the Somali Civil War in the 1980s and 1990s. Their inability to claim adequate state housing benefits or rent adequate private housing prevents them from experiencing the security of British citizenship or permanent residency. Displacement has reconfigured their relationships with home as a memory, a present materiality, and a future aspiration, forestalling their efforts at homemaking and rendering their homes permanently temporary. To listen to this distress is to centre the subjective experiences of people who are subject to multiple policy regimes, multiple converging crises, including those of housing, health, welfare, migration, and policing. It is to focus on the psychic dimensions, the inner life processes and affective states of experiences of housing without reducing them to the amorphous and exceptionalizing diagnostic of trauma. Critically, it is to attend to the distress that is generated not only by extreme acts of violence, but in everyday exclusions, slights, and miscommunications, in the everyday household as it encounters the state or private capital. To do so, I put forward ethnographic methods that focus on people's own theories of distress, their language, silences, symbols, concepts, and retellings of ordinary events, as the critical evidence to be listened to and captured. Through such listening, using ethnographic methods, we're able to make more specific policy recommendations that involve joined up thinking across government and non-government bodies and at across multi-level governance. In my work, and here particularly, I want to thank and mark my co-authors, Dr. Elizabeth Storer from Queen Mary University, who's a health geographer, and Dr. Suad Dwale, who is a counselling psychologist and member of this community, who make up my research team. I, my colleagues, have developed an approach to listening to housing distress across multiple property regimes that involves simultaneous attention to the structural forces and policies that converge to shape the home, the intimate relationships that the home holds, and the sensory experiences of the bodies within those homes. In India, as I detail in my recent book, I've listened to the Gurkha tension or distress of the house experienced by Gaddi tribal women of the Western Himalayas as they aspire to middle class, lower middle class, upward mobility through the undergirding income stability it required. I followed their symptoms of high BP, sleeplessness, and bodily pain as they articulated broader complaints of tribal and caste inequality, land enclosure, and gentrification. In Australia, I'm hoping to develop a project with collaborators at the University of Sydney to examine the claims that tenants make of the state to improve housing through their racialised bodies. However, in this particular talk, I want to illustrate my approach to listening to housing distress by going specific. So this is much more the society than the science side of the SSN. Taking you to the deprived but diverse ward of Small Heath in Birmingham, where the Somali women I met there taught me about the real and intimate cost of living precariously in the UK asset economy. The bustling high street of Small Heath lies in the historically deprived Eastern Ring of Birmingham. It acts as an economic hub for Somali, Syrian, and Yemeni people who've come to settle there over the past decade, seeking cheap rents, proximity to mosques, and kinship connections. However, commercial and residential property in this ward, the smallest administrative unit in the UK, is largely owned by British Asian landlords who arrived in the UK from Commonwealth countries following colonial recruitment to Birmingham factories in the 1950s. Originally housed in substandard Victorian and interwar private rentals in the Eastern Corridor, British Asians later purchased residential stock that is now being let to new migrant groups. While Birmingham's multicultural heritage is publicly celebrated, racialised groups remain disproportionately housed in substandard dwellings of the inner city, where these spaces are punctuated by the main arterial roads leading from the city, where residents breathe poor quality air and where health services are inadequately equipped to handle residents' needs. I was first brought to Small Heath by my collaborator and co-author, Dr. Suad Dwale, a Somali activist and counselling psychologist during the COVID-19 pandemic. COVID-19 had caused overwhelming mortality in Birmingham's Somali community, partly due to overcrowded housing, or what public health researchers called overcrowded housing. Together, Suad and I documented these experiences in a short film titled The Call Center, that you can see on YouTube if you're interested. The culmination of 2 years of ethnographic research on the legacies of stigma created by the COVID pandemic. In the summer of 2021, when we returned to screen the film to a group of 30 Somali women, we were set off on another kind of journey. As the film concluded, Suad asked, "What should we work on next?" "Housing," one woman cried. A chorus echoed this call. "Yes, I am a homeless. I am a homeless too." By the end of the session, more than 10 women had come forward to tell us that they were homeless. They weren't homeless in the classical sense of being rough sleeping or even couch surfing. These were women who were cycling through multiple forms of tenure types between temporary accommodation, hotels, hostels, often triggered by an eviction by a private landlord. Encountering these women, we were drawn into what Didier Fassin calls a counter-investigation to document the shape of homelessness in this community. Through the utterance, "I am a homeless," women articulated material deprivation, political abandonment, existential insecurity, and ongoing psychological distress that was invisible to the GPs that they visited regularly. To glean these multiple meanings, it was necessary to layer multiple methods from anthropology and psychotherapy. First, we collected housing biographies with women who came forward. Women adopted a testimonial form, relaying the circumstances of their homelessness in forensic detail, punctuated by dates and times of evictions, and sometimes offering evidence in the form of Section 21 eviction notices, letters from landlords and doctors, images of deteriorating homes. While these testimonies resembled accepted forms of witnessing in Islamic judicial practice, narratives were equally shaped by the legal genres necessitated within British and European asylum and housing systems. Multiple encounters with debt, housing, and legal advisors limited testimonies to the bureaucratic categories used by the state as a prerequisite to obtaining asylum or housing. They also involved notable omissions. Women didn't talk about their husbands, any of their male kin, their caste or class positionality in the UK or in Somalia. These omissions were important as they worked to shape the self-representation of women vis-à-vis the welfare state. We also ran 4 workshops held at the community centre using creative methods, body mapping, painting, dance, song, poetry, and drama, to allow women to share their experiences of homelessness. These workshops were sites of ethnographic engagement, but they were also sites of relationality that allowed women to remember and represent past homes and to imagine future homes for themselves and their children in ways that were uncontained by the modes of state spatio-temporal control, or the bureaucratic categories that I referenced before. These manifold representations of home yielded a rich symbolic language through which women expressed their experiences of homelessness and allowed us insight into the very distress that exceeded their testimonies or these biomedical categories that they encounter with the GP. Together, these approaches allows us to listen to housing distress across multiple genres of speech. The women sought voice, as the anthropologist Veena Das writes, both within and outside the genres that became available in the descent into the everyday. The genres that women drew on were diverse. They kind of mixed together Islamic theological concepts with state policy categories. They offered Somali cultural kinship idioms to describe encounters with local bureaucrats. These genres involve strategic temporalization, so making time and making space through their experiences, invoking what Laura Baer, drawing on the literary scholar Mikhail Bakhtin, calls chronotopes of their refugee experience, to refuse its exceptionalism and to insist on the persistence of their refugee status. As Baer puts it, a chronotope is a representation that materializes time-space in a manner that enables the dimension of time to become visible. They achieve this through thickening the dimension of time by a layering of the effects of images and narrative structures. We watched as women presented 3 particular representations of time-space three particular chronotopes that broadened the spatial and temporal horizons of their experiences of housing distress, thus contradicting or expanding the bureaucratic and legal categories that they were offered through which to tell their stories. In what follows, I will share three ethnographic portraits that illustrate these chronotopes. As a single mother, the COVID-19 pandemic was impossible for Ayan, who had to give up her job to take care of her children. Part of her struggle was that she had also brought her mother from Somalia to live with her. It was so stressful having Mum here, Ayan said. We haven't seen each other for years. I only met her once, many years ago. I've never really had a mum. I grew up in different families, so I never actually had a home. And that's why I'm so eager to protect mine. I make sure I have time for my children. Ayan was born in Somalia, but was separated from her family for most of her childhood as she was cared for by relatives in Djibouti and Yemen. She came to Scandinavia as an asylum seeker in the 1990s and settled in the UK in 2000 when she found it difficult to practice her faith in her country of seeking asylum. Since moving to Birmingham, Ayan had been sending money back to her mother, but her main aim had been providing a safe home for her own children. I don't even know half of my siblings, Ayan went on. That's why my family is so important to me. I said, I'll never bring up a family like this. I don't want them to be split up. There was no personal space in my childhood homes. It was always just too many people. It was overcrowded. I always say to my mum, I don't want to repeat the same thing as my ancestors, as all Somalis. But she says, what's the matter with that? She believes that the pain that she's gone through is worse, from the war, hunger, those sorts of things. So what you have to do is nothing compared to what I've had to go through. When Ayan arrived in the UK, her aspiration was thwarted by her inability to secure a house. She was frustrated by multiple evictions and moves between hotels and hostels. She framed this frustration not as an individual condition, but as one that marks the Somali diasporic experience. They don't give Somali people chances. They always see them as refugees just taking everything. That's the idea that they can't prosper no matter what, because they're always going to be refugees. We're always going to be takers. For Ayan, experiences of displacement and migration at the borders of Europe and the UK bleed into experiences of eviction and temporary accommodation. Such policies are entwined as mechanisms through which certain racialized groups, as Georgina Ramsey puts it, referencing the Australian context, are subjugated as threats to sovereignty, even after or as a result of being provided with legal national identity. At the fulcrum of these policies, the stigma and shame that issues from popular representations of racialized groups are used as tools to govern them. However, in Ayan's statement that we are always refugees, this stigma is turned on its head. Instead of internalizing this stigma, Ayan's temporalization of persistent refugee subjectivity works to push back onto the state that ought to provide for its citizens. In doing so, she connects her present experiences of precarity with a much longer colonial history of displacement and evokes a recursive chronotope, where her present situation is a new iteration of prior displacement and intergenerational experiences of colonial dispossession. In women's narratives, eviction was the site at which this recursive temporality, this kind of caesura in time, crystallized. Eviction was not experienced as a singular event outside the normal flow of life, but as a further iteration of an infinite number of events that occurred before and will occur again. As private tenants, women will be given a Section 21 eviction notice and told that their landlord's son is getting married. While these evictions were lawful, they were resisted by many women for their arbitrariness. Women sought other housing on both the private rental and through the council, but wait times were long and negotiations with private landlords were arduous. If they failed to leave the house, many recounted instances of being forcefully removed with their children and belongings or returning to a house with the locks changed. Evictions for Somali women are not experienced as a singular event, nor as only the state of waiting for a home. The chronotope of eviction is thick and layered, as if in a state of déjà vu. This déjà vu was painful, but it did not render women passive. Their refusal to leave housing, their insistence on state responsibility to provide alternatives, and the connections that they were making between evictions in the present and the past are examples of strength and agency. This déjà vu turns hegemonic representations of Somali people as undeserving of state welfare inside out by bringing longer histories of violence to bear on the present environment. In doing so, women insist on state culpability for their marginal positionalities, calling out racism in housing provision, and strategically making claims of the welfare state that has excluded them. Between evictions, women attempted to build stable domestic rhythms, cooking, cleaning, homework, to secure their children's lives and to avoid state child removal. These social reproductive labours were continually ruptured by the temporariness of their homes. Mona reflected on her experience of staying in a hotel. We didn't have somewhere to cook. There were 8 of us in 2 rooms. 3 boys and their dad would sleep in one room, while my 2 daughters, my little boy and I, would sleep in one room. My daughter studies year 11 and that time had exams, so we had to take a taxi to attend her exams, and it cost me £62. These disrupted domestic rhythms were experienced most acutely by those living in temporary accommodation hostels. Temporary accommodation is often far from temporary as an arrangement. Most households have lived there or in multiple forms of temporary accommodation for more than a year. Many are forced to leave on short notice through a text, staying in a string of places for short periods, unable to bring possessions. Often these houses were outside of the family's neighbourhood, where women were cut off from kin and had to take long bus or expensive taxi journeys to take their children to school. Houses were fitted with regulatory strappings, exit signs, fire doors, and safety notices that could not be changed and served as a constant reminder of the state's presence in their homes. Many were in extreme states of disrepair. Appliances or heating did not work, electricity lines were left exposed to water, infested with vermin, and were exposed to extreme mold and damp. The experience of living in temporary accommodation rendered domestic time uncanny. The uncanny in German is unheimlich, derived from the German word Heim or home, which Sigmund Freud defines as that which is friendly, home-like, arousing a peaceful presence and security as one does within the 4 walls of a house. Freud shows how the opposite quality of this word develops towards an ambivalence until it finally coincides with its opposite, unheimlich. For the women we encountered, domestic time was uncanny in the sense that any sense of present or future security remained illusory and was continually ruptured by horrifying presences. The continual intrusion of the state in visits from housing officers, landlords, or mold that they said invaded the home. These invasions were also temporal, the invasions of experiences of distress into the present, such that the house became an unhomely place. For Somali women, to be a mother and to build a home was a source of great respect, merit, and joy. Women saw their primary responsibility as to their children and the flourishing of their children as a source of pride and wealth. If a mother is unable to provide a home for her children, or if her children are removed by the state, this is a source of great shame. Such responsibility is complicated by generational divides in expectations of motherhood and home building. Many Somali mothers have not experienced stable childhoods and don't know their biological mothers. This opens an experiential gap between Somali women and their mothers. Instead of being able to transmit intimate, quotidian experience knowledge about childbearing and care, some see their mothers as unable to appreciate the violence of resettlement, having been through the direct violence of war and displacement while they themselves were young mothers. Recall what Ayan told us. I've never really had a mum. I've never actually had a home, and that's why I'm so eager to protect mine. When the shame became overwhelming, women's experiences of time would become estranged to a point of distress. This distress ran along the grooves of the jerky temporalities set by housing officers, social workers, private landlords, and a faceless digital bidding system. But it also breached their bodies and minds. Almost all the women who we met mentioned that they had experienced distress because of their housing situation, expressed as a deceleration or cessation of domestic rhythms sustained by their labour. Many mentioned that they found it hard to get up in the mornings, they couldn't eat or sleep because their head was too full. Others complained of physical ailments, asthma, aching joints that they attributed to their conditions of living. However, most were concerned with their children's health. All of those who were living in conditions of disrepair mentioned acute asthma, skin issues, and blisters and bedbug bites that their children experienced and encountered their children socially withdrawing. However, women made precise distinctions between distress that was caused by an unjust state and distress that could be reconciled as kadarka or destiny. Consider the following interview, and I won't read it just so I can speed up a bit. The chronotype of trauma that Somali women were drawing on in kadarka is Quranic, where the term is rooted in the Arabic qadar. As Geoffrey Husing recounts, the Quran can be found on a well-preserved tablet alongside a complete description of every real and possible determination or qadar of everything that will be or everything that could have been created, reflecting but also standing outside of human time. Somali women act on their situation by making careful distinctions between the elements of their suffering that are predetermined by God, such that they have to endure or accommodate these things, and those that were the work of an unjust British state. The use of kadarka indicates that their present experience of homelessness and the Somali diasporic experience of racialized marginalization is a condition that they must accept as God's will. In framing these generalized conditions as kadarka, Somali women are indicating the ways in which their lives are intertwined with relationships that exist beyond the earthly realm. These experiences are traumatic, but they are collective rather than individual. They ought not be a source of shame and self-blame. In contrast, the actions of other individuals, such as housing officers and landlords, are not sacred but human, and for these they are owed compensation. For those who are not awarded the full dignities of citizenship, who are excluded from national flourishing, there will not be change. But instead of resigning themselves to this disassociated state, women were adamant that because of, not in spite of their racial position, the state owed them a home. To conclude, what does A Homeless tell us about what it is like to live as a post-colonial subject in late liberal Britain or similar contexts like Australia? While the historical specificity of this condition ought not be bloated, the case shows that housing distress is not just collateral of late liberal policy, it is, for some groups, it's objective. Anxiety, as Anne-Marie Fortier puts it, is an enduring feature of the state-citizen relationship. The question of whose anxiety or distress is acknowledged and alleviated by housing, migration, or health policy, and who has to absorb that distress caused by such policy and perpetuates inequality is one that is inherent to the policies themselves. Usually, policies designed to generate distress are applied to groups beyond the citizenry, to migrant groups as forms of bordering. In the UK, housing and migration policy is one example of this, designed as part of post-Brexit Britain to generate distress and exacerbate it for particular groups in order to reproduce structural hegemonies that were forged through colonial relations. However, I hope these portraits have shown that policies designed to generate distress are being targeted at particular racialized groups within the citizenry, not in their direct ideological lilt, but in the technologies and calculi used in their implementation. Even though housing is a statutory right in the UK, it is so hard to access in a web of digital bidding interfaces, conflicting advice agents, blaming state officials, that making a claim to housing is near impossible and often the object of immense distress. As Tess Lee observes in the Australian context, such distressing policies are often targeted and has historically targeted the same groups that the present experience that experience historical experiences, such that they are haunted by such policy encounters. I end with a call to deepen ethnographic attention to distress within policy ecologies and to embolden our discipline in speaking with and back to policymakers and the dominant disciplines who generate the evidence that guides them. The cumulative and accretive nature of policy is often invisible to scholars who begin their inquiry with the policy itself, rather than the body or mind of the subject of that policy ecology. Following this distress ethnographically as it circulates at the macro-political level of policy edicts and ideology, productivity, growth or equality, the meso level of governance and bureaucracy through claims making and needs assessment, and the micro level of kinship and care, offers a fuller picture of how inequality is generated and perpetuated during converging crises.